Hey everybody, welcome to the show. My name is Jeff Vollmer. I am a GMAT and EA instructor for Manhattan Prep. Been doing this for a while. All right, got a slide deck for you to talk about essentially how we need to change the way we're studying for the GMAT in 2025. As many of you probably know, the GMAT underwent a sizable change about a year ago. The old kind of format of the GMAT was gone, and we replaced it with what was originally called the GMAT Focus, and has just been rebranded as the overall new GMAT now. And with this change in structure, change in format, also demands kind of a change, I think, in the way that we are studying for this exam. All right. And so I am here to kind of present the first of 3 episodes in a series about how to kind of like augment the way you're currently studying, hopefully. A lot of you are probably doing a really good job putting in the work already, and I want to give you some ideas for how to supplement that, think about studying a slightly different way that corresponds to the new kind of structure of this exam. So just to kind of start, maybe you've kind of like noticed that there are some people out there, some like GMAT gurus who can just kind of see the GMAT in like a little bit of a different way, right? Like they can see through questions and get to what the questions are really asking, right? They're able to draw connections among problems, or draw connections among problems that kind of on the surface seem quite dissimilar, but beneath there's some commonality linking them. And I think incorporating some of the ideas from today and in this series, you'll be better able to kind of see through these problems yourself and be able to make those connections, become better at reasoning and critical thinking on this exam. So this is episode 1. Episode 2 will be in a couple of weeks from now. I believe it's scheduled for February 17th here in the US. The title will be Interleaving Quant and DI Studies. I believe Ali Bell is leading that lesson. And then episode 3, I believe it's March 24th, and that will be Interleaving Verbal and DI Studies. And I think that one's going to be led by Ryan Starr, who does a bunch of these presentations. So, all right, let's start. And maybe like the place to start here is to kind of think about how not to study. Like what's like not the ideal way to study. And I don't think this is going to be a shock to you. So let's like imagine you're on like a 3-month study plan. All right, I'm going to take the exam 3 months from now. And so how do I want to organize the next 3 months? Well, what if I did Quant for like 4 weeks, right? Just like get in there, learn all the Quant content, right? Feel really good after 4 weeks. And after I've kind of mastered the Quant section, I'll move on and spend, a month or so on the data insights section. Let me spend 4 weeks on the data insights section, just learn all the different question types and get really, really good at this section after another 4 weeks. And then once I've done that, I've been putting off verbal for a while because I've always been a numbers person, but let me go ahead and take a look at the verbal section, spend 4 weeks there. I'm almost through my 3 months of study plan here. Maybe I have about a week to take a bunch of practice exams, and then I get in and I take the real thing. All right. I don't think we really need to spend a lot of time like dissecting what's wrong with this plan. This is kind of rhetorical, but like let's just in general think about why this study organization, type of study organization isn't wise. So like throw some ideas in the chat, like what is very clearly not great about this type of study plan. And while you're doing that, I'll present like a couple of analogies for you. Like I grew up, spent a lot of time as a musician. I went to undergrad as a music performance major, and I had to put on some recitals. Did I practice for them the right way? No, but I did some work. Okay. But let's say you're a musician who had to play like 3 big pieces on a recital. Like, would you organize your practice in this way? Would you spend a month practicing the first piece and then master that, and then spend the second month practicing the next piece on the recital, and then spend the third month only working on the final piece of the recital, right? Or like, let's say you were training for a triathlon. Like, would you spend the first 4 weeks just like working on swimming, and then the next 4 weeks just working on cycling, and then the next 4 weeks running your butt off? Like, probably isn't super effective for your long time learning and training and mastery, right? So, in this particular like example, by the time I get to my actual exam, right, it's been 2 months since I've really worked on the quant section, and that's not kind of training I want to have. All right, so we know not to do this, right? So what we see is like a lot of people will do something a bit better than this, like a step in the right direction. And so what they'll do is something like this. All right, let me just like start with a bit of quant and like feel good about quant for a bit. And then once I kind of understand a bit about quant, I'll move on to data insights, right? I'll study that pretty thoroughly, and then I'll study verbal, right? And then I'll start cycling among the three, right? So kind of go back through the loop over and over again until, you guessed it, time for a bunch of practice exams, and then I get in and do the real thing, right? So this is like a step in the right direction, right? But obviously, like, still not great. We'll see a lot of people do something like this, or maybe more specifically, they'll do something like this. Okay, I'll spend the first bit of my study kind of going through a couple areas in each of the sections. So quant, maybe it makes sense to start with kind of the foundational stuff, work on my fractions, my decimals, my percents, my ratios, my digits, my stuff like that, right? And iron out those things. And once I've got those down, I'll move on to like one of the DI topics, like tables, for example. Right? And then once I kind of understand that, I'll move on to part of the verbal section and I'll do some reading comp. We'll start with like general reading comp process, understanding main idea and primary purpose questions. And once I've done that block of quant, DI, and verbal, I'll go add another block. All right, I'm stacking on some more concepts here. I'll get into like the exponent and root concepts, right? If I just did some work on tables, maybe it makes sense to add graphs next. And if I've already spent some time doing some reading comp, maybe now instead of looking at the big picture questions, I'll take a look at the detail questions. Okay. And then we go again, right? Like what's up next in each? Okay, I've touched on algebra a little bit with exponents and roots. Let's get in there a little bit more and start doing our equations and inequalities. And I didn't list them here, but you might group absolute values and quadratic equations and functions with kind of the more like proper algebra concepts. We move on to other topics in DI. We move on time to break the seal on some critical reasoning stuff. Let's touch on argument structure and find the assumption. And then we keep going. Now, I'm not listing like absolutely every single topic here because that would be kind of ridiculous for a presentation like this, but you get the gist. Like we're just going to keep adding new modules as we go until we feel like we've covered everything that the exam can test us on. And then we say, I'm ready for the exam. It's time for practice exams. And we see like a lot of people studying this way, right? And so like, what are still some of the issues here, right? This is a step in the right direction, but a lot to be improved on here, right? And I think the issue that we see a lot of times is a lot of the students who study this way will report that they feel as though on practice exams and definitely on the real exam, they underperform, right? And the reason is because like practicing this way, where you're just looking at these kind of blocks of content all the time in individual sections of the exam, practicing this way is easier, right? Like imagine, I'm working on strength in the argument here. And I've done an hour of strength in the argument questions, and I really feel like I'm getting the hang of it, like I'm getting in a groove here, right? But I'll never be able to get into that type of groove on the actual exam, right? Because the exam is bouncing us around to different question types, right? So the exam won't let you get into the same type of groove that you've gotten into when you've been practicing this way. And so therefore we don't want to practice in a way that's going to look really, really different from the exam all the time. So and you can also see like we haven't really adjusted the practice exam issue. Maybe waiting till the very end to do your practice exams and kind of clump those in at the end isn't the best strategy. So we're going to make an improvement on this too. So what I want to kind of overview right now, and this will be kind of the theme of the day, is the difference between what we call blocked learning and interleaved learning. And there's a couple dimensions of this, right? Essentially, blocked learning is where you just kind of work on one content area, one concept, and you just rehearse it over and over again until you've like fully mastered it. And that can be useful to an extent, but it's not the way we want to study all the time because it's not the way the exam is going to test us, right? And so instead, what interleaved studying or interleaved practice looks like is it allows you to kind of cycle or shuffle through multiple concepts and you practice kind of having to pivot between them. And like interleave comes from the idea of putting like blank pages in like stacks of pages in a book or something like that. So leaves meaning like leaves of paper. Okay. And so some other differences between block practice and interleaved practice, right? Block practice is really good for short-term mastery, right? Like, oh, I feel really good. I've gotten into this groove of strengthening the argument, right? And short-term mastery is good, but it's not actually what we want to be after. We want to be after long-term mastery. And that's what interleaved studying helps push us towards. In addition, right, when we do block practice, studying feels a bit easier, right? Because again, you get into this flow state, this groove. And we don't want studying to necessarily feel easy because the exam isn't easy, right? So if blocked practice, like studying is relatively easy, in interleaved practice, studying is, yes, harder, but more importantly, studying in interleaved practice is more, what I'm going to call exam-like. And we want to be training in this way. And then finally, what we're doing in block practice, right, we're learning a specific skills for solving specific types of problems. And what interleaved practice allows us to do is we're learning skills for solving all types of problems. And this is what we want to do, right? We need to learn various skills to solve lots and lots of different problems, not just one type of problem. And this is important for things beyond just the GMAT. So I want to say, like, to be sure, you're going to need to do a bit of blocked practice at the outset of when you're studying, right? Just to get kind of familiar with some of the basic strategies, some of the foundational concepts, right? If you don't know how to do percent change, like we're going to have to spend a little bit of time understanding how percent change works, for example. But once we've kind of got those fundamentals down, right, now it's time to start mixing things up. And there's a lot of learning science out there that backs up why interleaved practice is more effective. And so what actually happens is when studies are run, they have a population that does blocked practice and a population that does interleaved practice, and they start in the same place. Where do they end up? And what the studies find is that the people who do the blocked practice, they feel they feel as though they retain more, right? And the people who do interleaved practice feel as though like they're not learning as much, right? Again, because studying is easier for blocked practice and studying is more difficult for interleaved practice. But when they take those kind of final exams and they analyze the data, what they find in the data is the people who did the interleaved practice, even though they didn't feel as though they retained more, they felt that they retained less, they actually did retain more. And the people who did blocked practice, they thought that they retained more, but they actually retained less. And so again, think about these students who feel as though they're just like crushing their study sessions, and then they're underperforming. They feel as though they're underperforming on the exams. Some of that can do with other factors like, you know, anxiety and things like that. But a lot of it can have to do with how we're studying, and how we're studying doesn't resemble the way we need to be thinking on the actual exam. All right, so if you're not doing any interleaving, like some of you might be saying, Jeff, I'm doing this already. I'm doing interleaving. That's great. But if you're not doing any interleaving, right, and you're just looking at like the same content area over and over again within the same section of the exam, then you have immediate room for studying growth here, right? Like I need to get you from over here to over here, right? And start mixing some things up. Okay, so if you're only organizing your study by doing one content area from the same section of the exam each study session, I need to get you mixing things up. And I think like most of you will be on board with that up till now, right? I don't know if what I'm saying is a huge shock. Maybe like you weren't actually doing this, but you kind of knew in the back of your head, okay, like, yeah, I should be changing the way I'm studying. I should be interleaving in this way. But if you are studying in a purely blocked way, right, if you are over here, hopefully I've convinced you to make some improvements by randomizing some things and shuffling some content areas, right? But do I do videos for the GRE? I do not do videos for the GRE. No. Unfortunately, I've always thought that my vocabulary is a limiting factor for me, and I just haven't spent the time learning all the words that I need to. But to be fair, I haven't done any GRE practice or stuff like that for a long time, so maybe I'd be better now. Who knows? Um, but maybe you're also saying like, Jeff, okay, I'm already over here, right? And I don't study in a purely blocked way. Like I'm already doing a lot of cycling. I'm doing something more like this, right? This is what I'm doing. Like when I started studying, I didn't even start necessarily with just content stuff. Like I started with thinking big picture about the GMAT, right? Like what's important on the GMAT. Sure, there's some quant and verbal and data stuff, but like really I need to think about my decision making. Really, I need to worry about my time management. Really, I need to work on my general logic skills. And I would say like absolutely, those things are really important. And once you kind of understood that, you start kind of doing some work in quant, right? You're doing some work in data, you're doing some work in verbal, and you're focusing not just on content, but you're focusing on process. And I would say, like, bravo, that's good. That's good stuff, right? You're doing better here. Okay. And then after I did that stuff, like what I did is I started stacking some more things on. And I also kind of continued to work in these broad process areas, right? It wasn't only about content. My study's never been only about content. It's about kind of working on other process things. And even as I'm building new content knowledge, right? Exponents and roots, graphs, details, I'm also going back and I am doing some of this interleaving. Jeff, come on, dude, give me some credit. Like I am doing some review of the past stuff. Awesome. That's great. That's what I like to see. And then beyond that, right, when I add even more things, like I'm still not forgetting to work on these big picture things. And as I'm adding more content stuff, I'm doing more review. And on top of that, I didn't wait till the end of everything to take a practice exam. I took a practice exam kind of at like the midway point in terms of content, right? Just to kind of see like, is the content I've already studied sticking? And if not, maybe I need to reevaluate. And how am I doing on these broad process things? How am I doing with my time management? How am I doing with my decision making? Am I getting really stubborn during the exam, or am I putting into practice the stuff I've been working on the practice exam? Right, so we take a practice exam, we don't wait till the very end, and we figure out what I need to work on. And then as I go, I'm working on adding more content stuff, right? You can see we haven't covered all the content here. There's more content. So here's what I'm doing. I'm adding remaining content. I'm improving fluency in processes, and I'm still going back and making sure I'm reviewing old stuff. So I'm not in that position where I swam for a month and then I waited 2 months before my triathlon. No, I've been continuing to swim over the next 2 months so that when I get to my actual race, I've done practice in all 3 events recently, right? And so then we take another practice exam and we iterate. And I would say like this is this is so much better. All right, like this is so much better. And it's likely that you're doing some of this interleaving in this way, like more frequent switching between sections of the exam. I know like this might be giving you a headache with all the different colors on here, right? But you've been doing more frequent switching and you're reviewing, right? And especially after these like initial phases where you have to learn a little bit of the general content. You're doing these mixes, right? You're doing mixed review as you go. Again, this is so much better than what we've seen in the previous slides. But I'm here to tell you, it's still not as good as it can be. All right, it's still not as good as it can be, and that's because there really is like this second dimension to interleaving that is really becoming more and more apparent on this particular version of the GMAT, right? The one that they changed to a week ago, right? So we've shifted what the structure of the GMAT looks like, and it demands now a new type of way to study. And I'm saying that this way was really, really great for the previous version of the GMAT, but now it's still not enough. There's something else we need to do. There's a second dimension to interleaving. Like in every study diagram I've shown you so far, this horrible one at the beginning, right? This one, all of these have quant, DI, and verbal as kind of separated, isolated from each other, right? Even in this one, right? I've got a line for Q, a line for DI, a line for verbal. And essentially, this is the mistake with continuing to study this way for this exam, right? These sections really don't need to be so isolated when we study. And that's because drum roll, all right, drum roll, dramatic pause, big text. Every content area that appears on this exam can appear in multiple sections of the exam and therefore on multiple question types. Yeah, cool. All right, sorry, I just got a comment in chat. I wanted to take a look at that. I'm going to circle back to some of these questions in a minute. Right, every content area can appear on multiple sections of the exam. Right, things are not isolated. Concept areas are not isolated only to quant or only to verbal and only to DI, but they cross section boundaries. And so we want to start studying in this way. All right, so the second dimension of interleaving kind of looks like this, right? Rather than just thinking about same content, same section, and then different content areas on the same section, let's think about like the other part of like the Venn diagram here, which would be, what about same content areas across different sections of the exam? Okay, so to better master these content areas that so many people are so concerned with, let's investigate how these content areas can be presented across different question types and or across different sections of the exam. So if you're studying up here, definitely make some motion in this direction, right? And if lots of people are studying here and lots of people are studying in this way, in this top right manner, I highly doubt that many people are studying in this bottom left way, right? Like, how can I look at, like, I want to study percent change. Percent change can be introduced in basically every kind of question type on this exam, right? Including on the verbal section, right? So let's make some motion to start studying this way. And I have a handful of examples for us to talk through here. All right. First example, let's take a look at this one. Go ahead and just read this question. This is a critical reasoning problem. It's from the official guide. I did not put the whole thing, but it's critical reasoning question number 710 in the most recent official guide, the big book. And I should not make any assumptions here. In fact, like one of the things you'll learn if you haven't learned this yet is a lot of what the GMAT is about like, how can you infer things to be true without making assumptions? Right? Like think about data sufficiency. Like, can you infer the answer to this question based on the given information? Like yes or no, and how much information did you need? Quant problems, right? They're asking for you to infer a value or an expression based on all the given information, right? Like reading comp, right? Like, can you infer that one of these things is true based on the passage, based on the information in the passage, right? What can you infer without making assumptions? What has to be true, not what is maybe true? And then in critical reasoning, a lot, it's like someone thinks something is true, and you have to kind of say, well, you might not be making a real inference there. You are overlooking some things. You're making some assumptions. And critical reasoning, what we've got is someone, probably a politician in this case, believes something to be true, and the politician has some support for that belief. And what we're going to do is we are going to try to figure out, why isn't that support enough to fully arrive at that belief? What's going to be the vulnerability here? So this is what we would classify generally as a weaken the argument question. Let's take a look at another one. Go ahead and just read this. And Sarah, I think I kind of hear what you're saying. You're finding it difficult on the verbal part. So much data, but not specifically. I wonder if you can just kind of refine that question for me so I know a little bit more about what you're talking about, and I'll try to address that. So here, this is a different section of the exam. This is a two-part question, right? TP. This is also from the official guide. All these problems on this slide are going to be from the official guide, even the physical book. And what we're asked to do here is there's an argument that's been given. Again, someone has an idea, a prediction, a hot take. They have a little bit of support for it, and we're asked to find a statement. One of the answer choices here, one of the answer options would strengthen that argument, and one of them would weaken the argument, right? So we can see that weaken the arguments can also show up not in the verbal section, which is where we normally associate them, but actually in the data insight section, right? Like what does weakening have to do with data? Oh, like they're there. They're on the data insight section. Here's another one. And this is not a typo. This is not supposed to be CR. This is RC. This is reading comprehension. Which of the following, if true, would most tend to weaken the conclusion drawn from some of this research mentioned somewhere in the passage, right? Again, official guide question 471, right? So the research has drawn a conclusion based on some evidence, and our task here is similar to what it was in the previous questions, right? What's not airtight about the support that allows us to arrive at that conclusion, right? Weaken the conclusion. Here's another one. As soon as I can find my cursor. Back to the data insight section, an MSR problem. This one actually is from, they don't produce the MSRs in your physical copy of the book, but this one's in the online question bank attached to the official guide of this year. I guess there's a couple arguments made in some of the passages, and we're looking to see if the statements in this MSR question, if they actually undermine any of the arguments. So what we're seeing here is, again, different sections of the test, but the strategies for tackling these problems are really similar. So why would we study them as if they're different, right? Like, it doesn't make sense to think of the verbal section and the data insight section as completely different entities, right? When they can overlap so much in content and in strategy, right? Like, we find the conclusion of the argument or the research. We find the information that's given to support that conclusion, right? We find the premise or the premises, and we consider what's logically kind of inconsistent between the two. Why doesn't the support or the premise automatically lead to the conclusion? And we can do that regardless of if we're in the verbal section or in the DI section, regardless of if we're in critical reasoning or reading comp or multi-source reasoning or two-part, right? Again, every content area can appear on multiple sections of the exam, and the GMAT's content is, this new version of the GMAT is actually really, really appropriate for this second dimension of interleaved study, right? In fact, think about like the way the GMAT is constructed and the motivation behind it, right? Like, this exam has been constructed in such a way, like under the influence of, people in charge of business schools and executives, right? It's built in such a way so that it tests the skills necessary for success in business school. Like, think about like the things you'll be doing in business school, like the case studies you'll be investigating. Like, you're gonna need to be able to have the ability to find patterns and phenomena across seemingly different areas. And the GMAT here is testing your ability to do that, right? So studying in this way will not only train you to get a higher score on your exam, and therefore a higher chance or probability of getting into business school, but it's also going to help you just process information better, to think better, to use reasoning skills better, to think critically better, and to perform better in business school when you get there, right? So we need to stop thinking about these question types and sections on the exam as so separated and so discrete from one another, and we need to start studying in a way that really reflects this understanding. All right, now sometimes, right, the content areas can present themselves in like fairly obvious ways, right? If you've done some studying already on your own and you've spent some time with weaken the argument question types, right? Perhaps like all of these problems are fairly easy to recognize as weakeners, right? Indicate a vulnerability, weaken the argument, weaken the conclusion, undermine the argument, cast doubt on the validity of things like that. Maybe you kind of spot those keywords and say, oh yeah, Jeff, I already understand that these are all weakeners. And I think ease of recognition can be super useful. And it's not uncommon to see that someone studying for this exam is like great, really excellent at a content area on one question type, but really struggles on the same content area on a different question type. Like I'm really good at statistics related questions on problem solving, but like I'm not really good at them on data sufficiency. Like, why is that? And so if you're tracking your progress on your studying, and you notice that, like, for instance, you're missing a high percentage of weakened questions on the data insight section or in reading comp, but you're like an ace at those types of questions in critical reasoning, right? Like, do some thinking, figure out what makes you so successful in critical reasoning, and apply those same skills to the other areas of the exam. It's likely that you don't really have to learn any new skills really to succeed on the same type of question in different sections. You just need to transfer them in some way, right? So sometimes the way to recognize these kind of commonalities will be somewhat clear. However, sometimes the connective elements between questions on different question types and sections of the exam won't be so obvious. So I have another set of examples here, and we're just going to try doing these one at a time. I'm going to give you a question, and I want you to think here, like, what content areas is this thing testing me on, right? So let's try that for this problem. Another problem solving question, which I guess is no longer really called problem solving. The book just calls it quantitative reasoning, but I put PS here just to make sure, because I imagine there's a lot of people familiar with this. But this is question 241 in the official guide, and just read this and just think like, hey, what kind of concepts is this bringing up? And maybe throw some of your ideas in the chat if you have them. I like this problem. It's hard. But if you have a certain way to think through it, it's not as tough, right? Initially, it can present itself as really difficult. Like even that first like sentence is a pain. They're sold at $250, which is a 20% markup of the dealer's initial cost. So like $250 is 120% of the initial cost. The initial cost is not an integer there, right? And that's like really annoying and frustrating to deal with. Like what kind of content areas are being brought up here? I guess there's percent markup, right? Percent change, maybe. There's translation. 685 is like a really strong score. Like, should you retake? It kind of depends on like what's the opportunity cost of retaking it, right? Like, um, would you qualify potentially for like scholarship offers if you got a 705 or something? Like maybe in that case it could be worth it. I think a 685 in general is like a good enough score to like check the box at a lot of like just about all the schools. It might depend a little bit on the rest of your application, and you really need like a pristine GMAT score to kind of put you over the top. Yeah, like should you retake it? It kind of depends on what your other options are, like with your time and energy. So it's hard for me to say that. I would say Toby, that's a question for like an admissions consultant, right? But 685 is great. Congratulations on that. So yeah, maybe this is about like percent change. Maybe it's about translating a giant word problem. Maybe it's about like profit and revenue and cost, right? And like the interaction of those three things. A lot of things it could be about. Okay. Say another question. So this is the question stem of a data sufficiency problem. I have not given you the two statements. I'm not going to show the entirety of questions here. Like what is this about? How are these two problems connected? Well, like in each case, you're kind of like getting different amounts of money for things, right? Like in this first problem, you're selling some things for $250 each, but like some of the other ones you don't sell, and I guess you sell them for negative money essentially. You lose money on them, and in here you have two different types of products, I guess, that have different prices. So maybe there's something common there. Right? There's some inequality stuff here, right? Like, did I sell more of the cheap stuff than the expensive stuff, right? And there's like some inequality stuff here, right? There's like 6 out of 60, so 6 versus 54 that were sold at different amounts. Like, I don't know. Jeff, are these really connected? Yeah, yes, they are connected. They are connected, I promise you. All right, let's take a look at another one. So this is a two-part question, question 452. Take a look at this one. Okay, Jeff, these are all about money. Yes, everything on the GMAT's about money. Like, no, this is not that surface level about money. Like, what else is going on here? And so maybe you're crystallizing some ideas. I think the next problem I put on the board will kind of like clinch it for you. Maybe you have some ideas. Think about like, are there any topics that come to mind that bind all three of these questions together? Do one more here. And I have others. There's going to be a fifth one. I'll save that for a bit. Fifth one. So this is from a table problem. This should say the ratio and proportion is a good suggestion. I think it's like, yeah, that's kind of like what do I want to call it? Like a prerequisite for understanding this other concept. But yeah, they're about ratios and proportions. I kind of like that. Yep, that's good. That is a good insight. And so this one is a table problem. This should say official guide online resource bundle or whatever. And because the tables aren't printed in your book. But this is a table that has like, I don't know, like 25 students in it, like just 25 rows of students. And each student gets a score on exam one, a score on exam two, a score on the final exam. And then those scores are computed to give each student a final overall score. And this word weight here kind of tells us like, oh, this is about averages and weighted averages. Okay. And there's enough information in the table to be able to determine like the answer, like if this statement is true, right? If the score on the final exam had equal weight with the score on exam two by comparing kind of the ways the numbers on the exams compute to the average, right? And then so like, let's back it up like this one here. Like how can Francois make a payment of 50% of his debt and Pierre make a payment of 10% of his debt he owes Claudine? But like, how do I get the 40% overall? Like, isn't the average of 10 and 50, 10 plus 50 is 60 divided by 2 is 30. Why isn't the average 30%? And it must be because, oh, well, the amount that Francois owes and pays Claudine is a greater number. And so it has a larger effect on the overall percentage that's been paid off. And so like Anurag's correct, like it's about kind of the proportion or the ratio and size of how much Francois has and then how much Pierre has here. And same thing here, right? Like what's the size of the final exam? How much is it worth versus exam two? And so now you can go back here and take a look at this data sufficiency problem and try to like interpret this from the weighted average perspective. Like, how is this a weighted average problem? I know it talks about literal weight in kilograms, but weighted average problems aren't always about like actual physical weight. They're about like the frequency with which values show up in a set. So is there more of material, is X greater than Y? Essentially asking, is there more of material A than material B in this broad mixture of material K? So like, if there's 10 kilograms overall, right? Imagine all of it were material A, right? Like 10 kilograms material A would be $30 for the whole 10 kilograms. And if the 10 kilograms were all material B, it would be 5 times 10 or $50 for all 10 kilograms. And so like what would happen if X and Y were the same? Well, if X and Y were the same, there would be 5 kilograms of the cheaper one, 5 times 3 is 15, and 5 kilograms of the more expensive one. 5 times 5 is $25. And so in that case, there would be a total of $40. So in a sense, like if there were a total of $40, then the average price per kilogram would be $4 per kilogram. So if there's more X than Y, there would be more of the cheaper stuff than the expensive stuff. And the average price per kilogram would be less than $3, or sorry, less than $4, right? It would be less than the straight up average. It would lean towards this value because there would be more of this product, right? So if the average price per kilogram was less than $4, or if the total was less than $40, that would be enough to answer this question. And I believe one of the statements gives you some information like that. And then what about this first one? Like, how is this first one, how would this first one kind of be considered a weighted average problem, right? Maybe I can draw this out, right? So we'll kind of step it up from the base level. It's because I love talking about weighted averages. We're just going to take a little aside, right? So like, let's take it up from the bottom problem here, right? Like if exam 2 were here on a scale, and exam, let's try to create a box of similar size. Here's the final exam. Imagine a world in which these two boxes are exactly the same size, right? This is exam 1 or exam 2. This is final exam. Right? The average score of these two would be right in the middle. Right? But if all of a sudden the final exam, which for some reason it won't let me mess with this box here. All right, we'll just do this. If the final exam is worth more than exam 2, think about what happens to this system. It would move the average this way, right? And so we can tell whether the two exams are like the same size or have the same weight based on where the average should sit. Let's do something similar with Claudine and Francois and Pierre. Right? So I know Pierre owes 10% or paid 10% of his debt, and I know Francois paid 50% of his debt, and the average is not right in the middle. The average is over here at 40%. And so what I can do is, if I can know exactly where the overall average is, I can pinpoint exactly how much larger proportionally Francois's payment is than Pierre's. And essentially the mechanics of this would be, well, because the average here, 40%, is 3 times as close to this side, right? It's 10% away from here, it's 30% away from here. So it's literally 3 times as close here. However much this money is, this would be 3 times as much. Cool. Let's take a look at the data sufficiency problem, right? Is there more X than Y? Right? Is there more X than Y? So the X is the $3 stuff. The Y is the $5 stuff. Okay. And so what would it mean for there to be more X than Y? Well, if there was the same amount of X and Y, right? Imagine those two boxes are the same size. The average should be right in the middle at $4 a kilogram, or $40 total. And so if there were now more X than Y, if there was more of the cheap stuff than the expensive stuff, my square has turned into a rectangle. I guess my square was always a rectangle. Then what should happen is the average should shift lower, right? And so this is kind of the question, like, is the average lower than, clearly missed the shift sign there. Is the average lower than $4 a kilogram, or is the total lower than 40 bucks? All right, so maybe these ones are easy to see or relatively easy to see as weighted average problems. The first one's a monster, right? So let's take a look at this first one, just how you can think of ways to solve it through weighted average. Because if we can spot this as a weighted average problem, I would say like, oh, this really shows kind of like general mastery of this topic and seeing it in a lot of different locations on the exam. So what we have here is we have like 54 cameras that are sold at plus 20%, right? 20% over, 20% over the cost. So profit of 20%. And we have the remaining 6, right? 6 were sold at a loss or refunded. So that means the remaining 54 were sold at a profit. 6 cameras were sold for what? Well, they were refunded for half the cost. So basically, you're losing 50% here. Okay. And so from this, what we can do is we can figure out the overall average. Like the overall average would not be in the middle because there are so many more cameras on this side than on this side. And so what we could do is we could pinpoint exactly where the average goes. And the way I kind of like to do this is I like to say, well, how many cameras are here? How many are here? There are 9 times as many cameras here as here. And so I need the average to be 9 times closer to this side than that side. Like, how do I do that? Well, the overall span is like 70%. I can break 70% into 10 groups of 7. And so if I put one span of 7 right here, would now get me to 13%. This is 7 away from 20%, and this is 63 away from -50. That's that kind of like 9-to-1 ratio that I want. So the answer to this question should be, it's actually not, it's not approximate, it's exactly 13%. And we can do that with weighted averages. The algebra is like way uglier. Okay? So lots of ways to kind of see these, the same concept be presented in different question types and on different sections. And so I have like one more weighted average problem for you, and it's from the verbal section. Right? So just take a moment and read this argument, and let's think like, how is this related? How is this a weighted average problem? Yeah, Toby, that's a great score. Like again, I think like a 685 is like good enough. Like people, schools are going to see 685 and like they're not going to have concerns really about whether you're like able to handle business school coursework and thinking and logic and reasoning. Um, so like you've definitely crossed the threshold where like schools will be like, we're not worried about Toby from like being able to survive the workload in business school and the thinking that's required. Like 685, I think in my mind definitely checks the box there. Because if it didn't, they wouldn't let people with 685s in, and then every school lets people with 685s in, right? So it's a great score. It then becomes like when you start being compared to the other people with 685s, right? Like how do you stack up? And if you stack up favorably, like then your score is great. And if for whatever reason you stack up less than favorably, then you might want to say, well, maybe a 685 isn't enough. Like I want a higher score, but many people would be would be very envious of that result. So again, congrats. All right, so this one, critical reasoning, it's a verbal question, yet it's about average, right? And it's about weighted average. Like just because the average amount of people who work in this one division of the company is 14 hours, that doesn't mean like most people in the company work 14 hours of overtime, right? It could be that like everyone either works 13 or 15 hours, and so it averages to 14. But it also could be weighted in such a way that like a lot of people are at 0, right? Think about like my little seesaw. A lot of people are at 0, and there's like a few people who do like 70 hours of overtime, right? And so like those kind of few outliers at like 70 hours of overtime might have an outsized effect on the average and bring it up to 14. So you might have only a minority of people working lots of overtime, and that could bring the average up to 14. So it doesn't have to be true that most employees work some amount of overtime. It could be that the vast majority work none, right? And so like these problems are far less obviously connected than the previous group of weakened problems, right? But the payoff for being able to recognize all of these as weighted average questions is huge, right? If you can study the weighted average concept, for example, from like all these different angles, right? All the ways they present a concept, you'll master it way better, right? And it's better to master everything about weighted averages, like why an overall percentage isn't just the simple average of these kind of two component percentages, right? Or like how to make an inference about weighted average from a table of lots of information, right? Or how to spot an opportunity to like rephrase a question about kilograms to a question about price or price per kilograms, or how to transform this like profit and loss question into a weighted average about like percent difference, percent change. And then finally, like why an argument about average hours worked is faulty because it makes an assumption about how the weighting or how the distribution of those hours is done, right? But like if you can master this and not just know the equation, right? Not just know the equation of how to calculate weighted averages when you see them on the quant section, but if you can master all of this, then you're really getting a step closer to be one of those thinkers we talked about at the beginning of the session, the people who can just see through a problem or view it from a different perspective or a different dimension, right? I have like another series of examples here I'll go through a little bit quickly, but like probability, like even something like probability that seems so quant focused can show up everywhere. And on this sheet, I omitted the problem solving and data sufficiency problems because that's where we're used to seeing probability. But this is a two-part question. right? And it forces you to kind of like understand what are the constraints when you need multiple probabilities, like when you have multiple events with probabilities, when you need them to both occur or neither to occur or one of each to occur, right? Like what's the philosophy behind that? How do the inner workings of that work? Here's a graphical interpretation question, right? Like reading data from a graph, they're asking about probability, right? Here's a reading comp problem about the probability of extinction happening in various like animal populations, right? And they talk about probability, right? The word probability is here, but then there's like one of the inference questions is about like, can you infer something about the reason something is dying, like the probability that something is the cause for the extinction, right? And so it's very kind of like math heavy there. And then again, here's another critical reasoning problem. Critical reasoning problem with probability. I'm going to give you a little bit of time here because this one's really interesting to me. Give you time to think about this one. So like this problem's really interesting to me because it's like the critical reasoning problem is of this group, the one that kind of requires the deepest understanding of probability on a conceptual level. Like not necessarily just how to calculate it and just memorize the equation, but really understand it at a deeper level. It forces you to confront like how probabilities are formed and how they can be kind of manipulated. Like, like the probability that a younger driver was in a serious accident last year was way higher than a probability that an older one was. And therefore, older drivers have more caution when driving and are safer. Like, I don't think that's right, right? We're looking at these two age groups. Like the probability that someone from a certain age range was in an accident last year is not the same, right? Definitely not the same as the probability that someone will be unsafe, like on their next trip, or will get into an accident when given an opportunity to, right? And like, why is that? Like here's kind of the information that talks about probability that someone was in an accident, right? And so what does this represent? I think we know probabilities are kind of can be expressed as fractions. Like this probability is like the number of drivers in a population and the number of them who got into accidents. Like how many drivers are under the age of 21 and how many of them got into accidents? 16%. How many were 21 to 24 and how many of those got into accidents? And then how many were over 65 and how many of those got into accidents, right? Like that's how this first probability is formed. And that's the probability that someone was in an accident. But what's the probability that someone will get into an accident, right? Like we're saying that this probability is less. These people are far safer behind the wheel. And that is the number of opportunities they have to get into accidents divided or under the number of accidents that will occur, right? And these two things like are just not the same. Like that first fraction isn't how you measure safety, right? This first fraction is how you measure how many people got into what percentage of people got into accidents, but is that a measure of safety, right? And so again, like I think it's just really interesting that it's the critical reasoning problem of all things that forces you to really think about probability on a deeper level. And so just like broad takeaways here, all right? Just like from the top, block less, right? Less block study, more mixing up, more interleave study in one of these dimensions. And like we're saying, there's two basic ways to interleave, right? It might be that a lot of us are interleaving this way already. That's great. Keep it up, right? We're looking at not just like one content area in one question type, right? But we're looking at the entire kind of section of the exam and the variety of question content things that can be presented in that. But then there's this second way to interleave, and this is what I'm emphasizing is really important for this new version of the GMAT. I guess it's a year old. Is a year old still new? Relatively new, considering how long the old one was around. That is, interleave this way. Try to take a look at one content area and see how it crosses the different sections. And all of this is to be better, like when we're practicing this way, we become better at recognizing what to do in problems. Like so much of the GMAT so many problems on the GMAT is like are won and lost in the first 30 seconds. And so if we can recognize like what's going on in a problem and like make connections to other problems quickly that we've done in the past, right? We have a better chance at getting them right. So this first way, right? We're training ourselves to recognize like what concepts are being tested, right? Like in the quant section, there's a lot of different concepts. If I'm interleaving when I practice, I'll better be able to kind of switch back and forth and recognize and switch gears. But I also want to be able to recognize like structures of problems at deeper levels. And that's what this second dimension of interleaving does. Okay. I want to be able to see kind of like these familiar elements presented in different ways. And again, when I see these presented to me on exam day, even in a location I'm not expecting it as often, like seeing probability and critical reasoning, for example, I still have like a mastery of that concept, and I know how to attack it. And I think these are like major steps, like these abilities to recognize what's going on. These are major steps towards becoming like one of those GMAT gurus, like one of those super decoders of the exam, or if you like the Matrix, the one of decoders of this exam. So how can you start like building this into your studies now? All right. So what I would recommend is, all right, come to our forthcoming episodes on this. So episode 2 again, February 17th. This is interleaving quant and data insight studies. So more specifically on those 2 sections of the exam, I believe Ali Bell is going to lead that. And then episode 3, March 24th with Ryan Starr. Ryan's great, such a character. Ali's great too. But you may know Ryan a little bit from doing some of these in the past. Interleaving verbal and DI. Okay, so come to those, put those on your calendar. And then the next thing that you can be working on is working on how you're reviewing your problems. Okay, and so if you haven't created an error log, get on that. An error log is basically a study tool that holds you accountable for problems that you struggled on in the past. An error log typically takes the form of a spreadsheet that has a column for the problem you missed, right? What number it is, where to find it, like what resource it's in, what page it's on, for example, and then a reason you struggled on the problem, the lesson you learned on the problem, okay, and a date to review it, a date to reattempt it. And I'm saying what we could do here is add some fields to your error log that will allow you to interleave in this second dimension. So one thing you could do, for example, is error log by content area, right? So add like what content area this question tests. And then I can see like, oh, I'm having trouble on divisibility. And divisibility comes up not just in quant, but also in DI, for example, right? I could error log other things like strategies that are appropriate for tackling this problem. Like, oh, like I could have chosen smart numbers on this quant problem, but I also could have chosen smart numbers on this graph problem or on this table problem or on this MSR problem, right? Things like that. I could have chosen numbers or tested cases on this critical reasoning inference problem to prove the answer is not true, right? So what types of strategies might be effective, right? Another example I had might be like within critical reasoning arguments, what types of arguments are there? Like, are there plans of action? Are there arguments about profit and revenue and cost? Are there arguments about causation? Are there arguments about kind of like a skewed sampling in a database, right? Things like that. Maybe like you don't always have to practice strengthen the argument questions and find the assumption questions and weaken the argument questions, but you could tackle, I want to work on causation arguments and work on causation arguments across all of these various critical reasoning question types, right? Another thing you could add, types of wrong answer analysis, wrong answer traps. Like, oh, I keep falling for these answers that do the opposite, right? Like I picked a quarter instead of 4. I picked 20% instead of 80% in this quant problem, right? I actually inferred the exact opposite thing. I got turned around in this reading comp passage, right? Oh, I weakened the argument instead of strengthened the argument. Like there are similar wrong answer traps that exist across all the question types. And maybe like organizing by that, you could review and study those types of traps, right? So get into that error log. If you don't have one, build it up. If you do have one, consider adding more fields to it, right? Track your mistakes, analyze where you're making the mistakes and the areas that are difficult, and review those areas across question types and sections. Yeah, so Anurag, good question. These problems aren't automatically sorted in the official guide, right? They're not like listing, critical reasoning problems as related to probability. So unfortunately, right now, you have to be putting in this legwork when you're reviewing and adding them to your error log. And it's possible that like there will be some resources coming out that will show how to label all these different questions by content area. But the official guide definitely does not have those now. And so we're gonna have to do some of that work behind the scenes. Yeah. Yeah, if this was easy, everyone would do it. But good scores like 685 and other great scores like aren't just given out; they're earned. And so this might be one of the ways that we earn this. So good stuff. That's essentially what I've got for you today. So just a reminder: come check out the next episodes in the series. Ask questions when you're there, and yeah, try to incorporate some of these new ways in your studying. And good luck with it moving forward. Thanks everybody for coming. Thanks for watching on YouTube if that's how you viewed it. If you thought this was useful, hit the like button. And that way you'll be kind of like notified. If you subscribe to the channel, you'll be notified when other videos like this come up on GMAT and you'll get some reminders of when like the other episodes in this series are coming out. So thanks everybody. Appreciate you. Question just came in about issue in completing the practice test in terms of time management. So I would say rule number one when doing these practice exams is you got to finish. Right? I would say that should be one of your rules when you're studying, right? Like practice studying again in the way that the test is going to force you to do it, and that is practice studying on the clock, making decisions under appropriate amount of time. If you do not finish the practice exams or the real exams, your score suffers tremendously. In fact, I was at a conference at the GMAC headquarters in Virginia in October or November, sometime in the fall, and they actually told us like how they calculate the penalty for not finishing a section, and like everybody's jaw like dropped because they hadn't released that information before, I don't think, and it was like way more severe than anyone really expected. And I don't know if I'm supposed to reveal that here, but basically, if you leave one question blank on one of the sections, it probably will drop your score 20 points, maybe 30 points. Yeah. Yeah. So imagine like not finishing one question on DI, one question on quant, and one question on verbal. Like your score might drop like 60, 80 points, something crazy like that. Yeah. It kind of depends on some other factors, but it drops a lot, way more than it would drop if you just got the problem wrong. So really have to practice finishing. Gotta finish. And ideally, like you're not just finishing by guessing randomly at the very end, but you're giving yourself a chance to try the problems. And the way to do that is don't get stubborn. Don't try to be perfect on all the earlier problems, right? If you understand that you're probably going to have to guess on a couple problems, what you want to do is leverage that understanding and choose to guess on the really ugly looking problems when you see them, rather than being forced to guess randomly on problems at the end of the section that you might be able to do if you had some time, right? So really try to empower yourself to like decide, I don't want to do this horrible problem. Don't be stubborn, right? Don't be stubborn and say like, I really want to be able to do it and prove something to myself. No. We want to just like get the highest score possible on this exam, and being stubborn is usually not the way to do it. So probably just like a mindset shift we got to work on there. Yeah. When you're studying, I would do the same thing, right? Practice making good decisions on the clock. And at least when you're studying, like when you're done doing the timed pressured version of the studying, then you can go back and spend unlimited time reviewing the problem. But if we're not practicing that way under time pressure, we're probably not going to be able to flip the switch and do it on test day. Anyway, my 2 cents there. Awesome. All right. Thanks, everybody. Abhijit, thank you very much for hosting again. I appreciate all your work here.